So I'm going to take a turn that might be a little unexpected, although I did kind of give people a heads up last week. But for the next couple of weeks at least, I'm going to be talking about World War I, and particularly the Versailles Treaty as seen through the eyes of John Maynard Keynes. But I wanted to start out with just a little observation about why I would want to look into this and into Keynes' reaction. Why and why now? Well, we're now at a time in our society of a no-compromise attitude and hardened positions on at least two sides. It seems like we're very polarized. And there's no backing down. And people are putting themselves in a position where if they compromise or back down, they would not even be themselves. They're so tied up with their particular political position. It is deeply ingrained at this point, and there doesn't seem to be any way out. And if we used our imaginations to try to think what would be the way out of this conflict, which seems endemic and its escalation seems inevitable, it would have to be one side or both sides in that conflict stepping back and being bigger than they are, stopping themselves from doing something that at the point of conflict is actually quite rational, but in the long run they know will continue to make things worse for everybody. Why is that? Because especially in the modern world, we are so entangled with each other, economically, socially, and politically, and even biologically. The virus has taught us that we can't escape each other. We want to, and that's totally understandable. If you've been married, you know, lots of times you definitely want to just escape that other person. You just want your space. You might even still really love them, but you want your space, right? Because it's difficult to deal with other people. So we've got these hardened positions. We refuse to give in. But at the same time, we know deep down, the only way out is to be bigger than that, to actually refuse to react. So I want to go back to World War I because it's this time in the modern world where positions were hardened, they were fixed, where countries were poised for conflict, where there were deep national hatreds and resentments that seemed ineradicable. And World War I was set off in an almost like chain-like or domino-type fashion, as though there was no way it could be stopped. So John Maynard Keynes, he wrote this book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, about the Treaty of Versailles. And he wrote it 1 year after the war ended. The war went from 1914 to 1918. So he wrote it the year after, and, in the midst of, or it reads like towards the end of the treaty and extrapolation process. But he was there, he witnessed a lot of the proceedings, and this great economist was appalled at the outcome. And the reason he was appalled was because the victors in the conflict, the Allied powers or Entente powers, were trying to extract so much from Germany and its allies that it would cripple not only those countries, but because of this inextricable nature, of everybody involved, especially economically, it would hurt all countries. It would hurt the world. He said in one place in this book early on, if we oppose in detail every means by which Germany or Russia, and they were at odds with each other in this war, they were on opposite sides, by which Germany or Russia can recover their material well-being because we feel a national, racial, or political hatred for their populations or their governments, we must be prepared to face the consequences. That quote in this book struck me very hard because it reminds me again of our nature as sort of, I think we're sort of intellectually, mentally, spiritually, emotionally children. And we haven't advanced in this time. We're over 100 years past this event, and we haven't really changed in our mentality. And there are a lot of ways in which we're very similar to the people that engaged in this conflict of World War I. Now, as I told you before, I'm not a military historian. One of the viewers suggested that people listen to Dan Carlin's Blueprint for Armageddon series. If you want to do that, you can find it on iTunes. And you just buy the first episode. It will take you through how World War I got started and the different characters involved. It's excellent, and I highly recommend it if you haven't listened to it already. Dan Carlin's Blueprint for Armageddon. So I'm not a military historian, but I went back and listened to that, and what I drew out of it was that it demonstrated human nature at its worst, which is almost always the human nature that's on display. It's certainly the human nature that's been on display lately in the United States and around the world when it comes to right versus left-wing politics, when it comes to pandemic politics, and so on. And so, what are the main deep ingredients that seem to propel us into positions like this, where there doesn't seem to be any way out? Some of them are deeply ingrained in human nature, and it takes a great deal of strength and effort to resist these tendencies. And one of them is the will to power, or animus dominandi. Nietzsche wrote a book about it, The Will to Power. Right? The people are driven by the desire to dominate more than anything else, more than being rational creatures, not really rational at all. We desire to impose our imprint on the world. Hans Morgenthau wrote about this too, and came at it from the point of view of the flawed, sinful human nature, a tragic nature that just can't seem to ultimately escape the desire for power, and wealth being one of those means of obtaining power. And this is what causes, in Morgenthau's view, all of the things that lead countries to build up and to guard and to watch each other, which inevitably leads to conflict. Morgenthau treated it as something that one couldn't get past. So the best one could do is try to have a rational foreign policy that basically somehow handled that and corralled it and controlled it. But that is a deep aspect of human nature. From the Christian perspective, it stems from original sin, okay? The Augustinian observation that human beings are sinful by nature, the very best can escape for only a while with the grace of God, heaven only exists in the hereafter, and governments are needed on earth, governments with teeth, in order to keep people from just wreaking havoc. So animus dominandi is one factor. Another factor in human nature that comes through definitely in this history is the shadow. Okay, now that is a term that I derive from Carl Jung's psychology. Okay, Jung posited that we have this archetype within us, the shadow. Everybody has a shadow. It's that part of oneself that usually we keep in the unconscious. We don't acknowledge it, but it is that evil that lurks within, such as the desire for power. It's bloodthirsty, it's cruel, it's violent, it discriminates, it's vile. And Jung said, we all have this, but we don't want to recognize it. We suppress it, and then we project it. And this is scapegoating. So instead of sort of dealing with our own evil and realizing that we and everybody else that we're dealing with has a good measure of it, and that it's wonderful if people can keep it under control, and that's not common. Instead, we feel it, we fear it, and we project it onto an enemy. So yes, I mean, we do have enemies. This is not the whole cause or reason why enemies exist. But what this does is it turns the enemy or the opponent, the group or the people or the person whose interests are counter to yours or are standing in your way somehow or potentially problematic. It turns them into evil monsters. This is what we do, right? We turn them into evil monsters that we can't compromise with, that we have to try to destroy, that we have to try to completely get rid of, okay? Remember as I'm talking about this, that we're not talking about just World War I, but the situation now. And think about how much scapegoating goes on both the right and the left in our contemporary context, right? In which the other side is treated and seen as the absolute evil, is caricatured, is made fun of, is reviled, is spoken about in apocalyptic terms, okay? That's scapegoating. And that's a psychological mechanism in order to keep evil at bay, right? Out there on the other side and not to recognize it within. Jung said for a person to mature, to become not an infant or child, but an adult human being, one has to individuate, which means one has to actually learn about this aspect and other aspects of their character, right? And has to acknowledge it openly, right? And then hopefully be able to keep it in balance and to turn it even perhaps into a positive rather than a negative source of energy. But we all have the shadow. We all have the evil within. And shockingly, we don't want to admit it. Another endemic feature of human life is fear. And it stems from these other things, right? We fear that which we deep down feel is within us that we project. We fear the will to power of others, and we try to figure out how to get there first. That certainly was the case in World War I. That's part of the reason it was triggered, is because the various powers involved, especially Germany at first, needed to get there first, act first, because they knew that others would soon act that they might not be able to suppress, namely Russia. So they tried to act first because it seemed like the rational thing to do, and they were fearful if they didn't, they'd be destroyed. But fear is this feature of human life which basically enslaves us and makes us feel as though we're boxed in and we have no choices. Our number one goal is to survive, it makes sense, even just from the evolutionary perspective, right? We want to survive. That's the imperative. But in the process of seeking survival, we then very weirdly decide to do things that are almost inevitably going to either hurt us and or kill us. Same thing here, right? So we start conflicts because we are so controlled by fear, knowing also that by going into the conflict, we are risking our very lives. So we aren't escaping fear. Anyway, this is a great irony, right? And a huge feature of the human condition. Then we add this ingredient in the modern world, right? And certainly by World War I, masked man had been around a while. But I am sure that even during World War I know this because I've studied a little bit, okay, there wasn't the comprehension of the effect that this would have. Mass warfare was what was on order, right? The use of thousands and millions of men and the employment of millions more in producing what it took to fight this war. And this starts with the French Revolution and the Enlightenment philosophy that brings the common man into the military, that creates these mass armies that hadn't been seen since the Roman Empire. And they're equipped with incredible technology compared to then. But this mass man phenomenon is not to be understated, and it's still very much with us today. Why could they deploy these mass armies? Because for some reason, as things changed, both the economy and the political atmosphere changed towards more mass production as well as mass politics, mass mentality went with that. And it was easier for people to be led en masse towards certain political positions, towards actions that wouldn't seem rational. Okay, I watched a documentary a few years ago called "They Shall Not Grow Old." I think it's from 2018. If you haven't watched it, go find it. Okay, it focuses in on the British actually, and how they got involved in the war, and it shows these young men, some of them very young, below the actual age that they should have been able to join, maybe 15 years old, going jolly into warfare, ready for valor and honor, kind of knowing the weaponry that was being used, but not comprehending exactly what difference that would make in the experience of warfare. They get to the battlefield, the trenches are already dug, it's total carnage, and they are surprised. Okay, so how did they get there? Well, part of how they got there was this mass phenomenon, right? Of people being told, this is what you're going to do now. This is what we as a nation are going to do, and here's why, right? It might not have been so easy to persuade in earlier eras. I don't know. It's something to think about. So we have mass man as the ingredients. And also then we have accelerating technology as an ingredient. And again, same then as now. Accelerating technology is a part of our problem, right? Both social media or the internet in general, and we have accelerating technology in the way of biological weaponry. We have, more hope of superseding such things with modern medicine. Accelerating technology in World War I led to the ability to do just incredible damage, right? And people's minds, the way people thought, could not catch up with the technology, right? So those boys go into the battlefield and they're surprised. But even the generals and the leaders of these countries were surprised. There were like cavalry charges at the beginning of World War I. And they knew that they had machine guns, heavy artillery, okay? Bombs that could do some major damage, create craters in the earth, but they charged in at first with their cavalry, right? Or they would line up like the Napoleonic army, in straight rows and walk into machine gun fire, okay? Why did they do that? Now, you can look back and say, well, they were just stupid. Stupid like we all are now, right? There's really no difference. The technology changes. We can't fathom the impact it's going to have on our lives. We tail it, and it does incredible damage because of that. If we could step beyond it, right, and think about it, think about the total impact, what could be done with it, right? And by the way, one of the things Carlin talks about is there were people at the time, before World War I set off, there were people who did write about this and talk about this and knew that this weaponry was going to change everything, but they were few in number and nobody wanted to listen to them, apparently. So now, technology continues to accelerate to the point where it seems impossible. But there are technological ethicists out there. There are people out there who are writing about this, but nobody wants to listen to them, and they aren't in charge. So anyway, accelerating technology is in the mix. And then you have to have fodder. And in a way, I've already talked about this. This is mass man. These are the expendable people, right? Of which the vast majority of people are expendable from the point of view of power brokers willing to start these kind of conflicts, whether they're wars or whether they're culture wars or ideological battles. The people in charge of those who cook them up don't really care about the masses of people who are going to be thrown into that battle and have their lives destroyed or their families torn apart. And so in World War I, there was also plenty of jolly fodder. Then there has to be a trigger. In World War I, the trigger was this Gavrilo Princip, who was a Serb nationalist who shot the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophia. And with that assassination, triggered the hostility, of course, of Austria against Serbia, but more importantly, Germany. And the system of alliances had already been set in place by Otto von Bismarck, but apparently Bismarck not in charge anymore, not there, and the picture had been fired by the Kaiser. Not there to handle that situation. That system of alliances was triggered by this event, and nobody pulled back from it. Nobody pulled back from what seemed like an inevitable conflict. So this trigger could have been anything. It didn't have to be this assassination, but this is the thing that started World War I. And there always is a trigger, but I want to emphasize the trigger is the excuse. To say that Princip started the war, or that the cause of the war was the Archduke being assassinated, would be wrong, would just be wrong, okay? The cause of the war was all this buildup, the opposing alliances, the feeling of inevitability, the national resentments that had built up, the weaponry itself, which provides an incentive to be used, all of these things. But not this one event. If it hadn't been this, it would have probably been something else, someplace else. Then, of course, there's the reaction. And this is what I want to focus in on in the series as a whole. Not the specific reaction of World War I even, but just this choice to react, okay? Because it's at this point, despite all these other things which are so heavy on human nature and the human condition, there is, at least I like to think, also a choice. A choice. How are you going to react to whatever that trigger is? In World War I, of course, the reaction that happened was predictable. And a huge and disastrous conflict ensued. But that wasn't the only choice. And it seems as though you'd have to be superhuman not to fall for the bait in a conflict like that. Or then or now. That you'd have to be above human, right? In order to stop yourself from reacting to the trigger. But the truth is, and this is the case with World War I, of course everybody would have been better off because, as Keynes points out before the fact, he said, because of this war and because of the Carthaginian peace, as he put it, of the Versailles Treaty, and how much was extracted from the Axis or Entente powers, another conflict was inevitable. So we wouldn't have had World War II if we hadn't had World War I, of course. So the choice to react seems inevitable, but we have to recognize that the reaction almost always leads to just more conflict. And so it's not rational in the long run. I thought you might like to see this. This is what I'm having today. Did they have torpedoes in World War I? I'm not sure. I think they had submarines. Maybe. These are difficult times, which is not unusual in human history. So we need to look back and see what mistakes other people made and see if we can grow up. We've got to grow up. We've got to grow up soon. It's not in anybody's interest to keep these conflicts going. Well, yes, it is. It's in the interests of power brokers to keep these conflicts going. But it's not in most people's interests. So I hope you'll stick with me for this series. I'll see you next week. Bye.